On today's EcoSense for Living, we explore the many sides of living with predators. Is it possible for grizzly bears and wolves to live alongside development? Grizzly bears and wolves are two of our national treasures, but for the people that live near them, the relationship can be tricky.
We consider ourselves the radical middle in that when you get to species like grizzly bears and wolves, some people want them wiped out. Some people just don't ever want them hunted.
People who have never seen a grizzly bear, it's important to them knowing that grizzly bears are going to continue to thrive on this landscape.
There are too many bears in some habitats of Wyoming. So we're starting to see movement into human-dominated landscape that typically aren't good for bears, they aren't good for humans.
Yes, wolves kill, bears kill, but you know what's happened is humankind has moved in on their territory. And because of that movement, all of a sudden, the four-leggeds are the bad guys.
There's some not so good baggage that comes with some of these big animals. I have witnessed both wolves and grizzly bears where, in my opinion, they're supposed to be, is in the wild, not alongside a highway, not through the windshield of a vehicle.
Everybody acknowledges there's no easy answers to ranching with carnivores, but a lot of us believe that it's kind of our responsibility and our privilege to try to find ways to live on the landscape, doing productive agriculture while also coexisting with native species.
We pray that all the grizzlies from Yellowstone and everywhere else will come to our reservation during the seasons, so no grizzly has to give up its life. That's what we pray for.
How long have you been studying the grizzly bear?
Well, we produce an annual report every year, and our data do go back to 1975. So this is one of the longest ongoing studies on any large vertebrate in the world, really.
How long does it take them to breed and reproduce?
Grizzly bears have a relatively slow reproductive rate. So typically, they don't produce their first litter of cubs until they're about 5 or 6 years old. Then they produce a litter, and if that litter survives, then they'll stay with the mom for about 2.5 years, and then a new reproductive cycle starts. So it's about 3 years before the entire reproductive cycle is over. What we've seen since the early 2000s is that more cubs dying earlier. So cub survival has declined and yearling survival has declined, and we think that that is related to other bears killing them. It's not uncommon for a male grizzly bear, for example, to kill younger cubs that are vulnerable.
When many grizzlies are in one area, like Yellowstone National Park, there's not enough resources and territory for all of them to thrive there, so they migrate elsewhere.
And so we have now bears moving into places that haven't seen grizzly bears for decades. That's causing a lot of conflicts because they're running into places where people are simply not used to seeing grizzly bears, and they're maybe not quite prepared yet in terms of storing garbage and making human foods inaccessible to bears.
Well, are there people on the ground that are educating these folks on how to live together?
Yeah, basically from the beginning, from the 80s on, agencies involved have been very active in what we call making people bear aware and developing bear aware communities.
It's always challenging when grizzly bears show up in a new place for the first time, and we're trying to be proactive. It's not just farmers and ranchers either. In the Big Sky country, we had tremendous garbage problems years ago, and bears are being drawn to garbage cans.
Grizzly bears are very adaptable to food resources. They're omnivores, they eat a lot of different foods.
They are drawn to grains, they're drawn to beehives, they're drawn to chicken coops. And so we're learning in many of these areas to take proactive measures to keep these bears out of trouble. And what that looks like is carcass management. So when you lose cattle on your land, you get that carcass off the land very quickly because that draws grizzly bears. You put electric fencing around chicken coops, beehives, and calving yards, and then you have range riders out there. And the sterling example of this is the Blackfoot Valley in western Montana, where they've reduced conflicts with grizzly bears by 93%.
We've had livestock killed here by wolves and grizzly bears. Nothing catastrophic right on the property, but in our adjoining rangelands, we've had 5 cattle killed in one instance in one attack by wolves, and had a few others killed by grizzly bears.
When those problems happen, it's a lose, lose, lose. First off, a rancher loses livestock. The bear is either killed or translocated, and our state and federal agencies have to expend tremendous resources, time and money to address the issue. So it's in all of our interest to get out ahead of that and prevent the problems in the first place.
So is there any compensation for ranchers who are trying to buy electric fence to keep their animals safe from predators?
Well, there are some assistance programs for that, but then there's also a livestock compensation board that reimburses ranchers who lose livestock to native carnivores like wolves or grizzly bears. We have a guard dog and a guard burro. Our burro, Ruby, who's coming over to see us, she's very alert.
So what are you raising here?
We raise sheep, we sell certified grass-fed organic lamb, and we also make stuff out of the wool. This is a really small ranch by Montana standards. We're operating on about 160 acres.
So can you tell me about predator-friendly ranching?
Predator-friendly is a term that means basically it's a group of ranchers who raise their livestock without lethal control of native carnivores like wolves and coyotes and bears and mountain lions. And everybody acknowledges there's no easy answers to ranching with carnivores, but a lot of us believe that it's kind of our responsibility and our privilege to try to find ways to live on the landscape, doing productive agriculture while also coexisting with native species.
So is that a small group of you, or is it growing?
Well, there's not a huge number of ranchers who are literally certified predator-friendly. And, you know, some of the traditional ranch community would never want to use a term like that. I just met a guy from Oregon a couple of days ago who said he would like to use the term predator smart, which I actually think is quite a good idea. But there are also lots and lots of ranchers, sheep ranchers especially, who are using non-lethal control as one of the main tools in their toolbox.
Can you explain what the non-lethal control is?
Yeah, the lethal control involves things like shooting, trapping, poisoning, stuff like that. But there's a variety of non-lethal approaches that don't involve killing the native predators like bears and coyotes and mountain lions. A lot of people, rather than just running their livestock across a whole ranch, they'll restrict the movement of the animals and keep them clustered. So that might mean temporary electric fencing on a place like this, or people who are operating on larger rangelands often will have a herder, a human herder, or cattle ranchers often will use range riders that involve people moving with the cattle, keeping an eye on them, keeping them tightly managed. But none of these tools are silver bullets. None of them are easy, although most of them are easier than staying up all night trying to shoot wildlife in the middle of the night. It's really hard to be on guard 24/7. The animals do a better job than we do.
Are there any incentives for ranchers and farmers to want to protect these predators?
Predator-friendly isn't as widely known as something like dolphin-safe tuna, but it's the same idea as an eco-label like that. And it definitely is a way to attract people's attention.
When they reintroduced the wolves, how did you feel about that, and how did all of your ranching community feel about that, and then how do they feel about it now?
Well, when the idea first came up, as I'm sure most people realize, it was extremely controversial. The wolves were starting to migrate naturally south from Canada. Some people thought it made more sense to allow that slower process to occur. But of course, the argument against that was that it was going to take so long that human habitation was going to make that game unrealistic. It still remains controversial, and of course a lot of people didn't like it just because they didn't like the idea that it was a government program. I have enormous respect and admiration for wolves and grizzly bears, but to me it isn't about just the hype of particular high glamour species. We need to find ways to farm as if nature matters. And to me, predator-prey systems are really just one of many natural systems. All the hydrologic systems, the pollinator systems, other mammalian migration systems. We need all this stuff. And whether humans understand it fully or not, our fate on this planet, I think, is tied to the fate of those natural systems, including the animals.
Under the Endangered Species Act, grizzly bears have been listed, delisted, and listed again. State wildlife agencies want the flexibility to manage hunting them. Advocacy groups say grizzly bears still need protection. Even among hunters, not everyone agrees on whether they should be hunted.
Serious environmentalists understand that hunters are some of the biggest conservationists out of there.
I was raised in a family that hunting is part of our tradition. It was part of, rite of passage of being old enough to go to hunting camp and bring home meat for the family.
We hunt for the elk, mule deer, moose, bighorn sheep, black bear, and wolves. Where if the grizzly bear becomes available to hunt that, that's not to be my main focus.
I have no interest in hunting a grizzly bear, and yet I support them being hunted someday, and I know that's difficult. It's just every hunter has the species he or she is interested in, and I have no interest in hunting grizzly bears.
The Tribal Business Council agreed, sanctioned what the elders were saying, and it was primarily, the grizzly bear is a sacred member of our community. We do not support any further hunting of the grizzly bear.
They were listed on the endangered species list in 1975, and at the time of the listing, the bear population had dwindled to about 136 bears. The managers, federal managers came in, they were doing scientific management of the bear and setting a recovery goal, and the goal under the Endangered Species Act was 500 bear, is what they wanted to get to in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem.
And the endangered species is basically an emergency room when a species is teetering on the brink of blinking out. But once that species is recovered, the proper agencies are state agencies that manage all kinds of other species.
The estimates are that the grizzly population in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem now are in excess of 700 bears.
So of those 700, we have about 70 grizzly bears that are collared that we being the 3 states, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, along with the Yellowstone National Park and Grand Teton National Park, and local tribes with the Wind River Indian Reservation, we monitor those bears and their movements in the ecosystem.
Looking back, there were 20,000 grizzly bear. Now there's 700, and there are around roughly 500 wolves. To me, that doesn't really sound like an abundance of either one of those species. So can you help me understand how that's an abundance of animals?
What's the goal line at the end of the day? Is the goal line 20,000 grizzly bears? Is the goal line 40 million bison in America? I mean, the truth is we have habitats, and habitats can hold certain amount of species. And when I say abundance, what I mean is that the species are growing in numbers that, according to the wildlife biologists, federal and state, are in excess of the recovery goals that have been set there.
The biggest threat to bears right now is having the social tolerance for bears. When you look at the historic range of grizzly bears across the West, there's relatively few places that they've recovered and have come back to the point where we're having this discussion today. Only about 2% of their historic range grizzly bears occupy.
Under today's condition of modernity and the politicalization of wolves and grizzly bear, it seems as if this Western thought somehow has adopted an extremely negative, hostile, arrogant attitude that these species in the overall food chain are not necessary, or they have to be monitored, regulated, and terminated.
Is there any meeting of the minds between, animal rights activists and hunters? Is there any way to meet in the middle with this?
We need everybody at the table to do conservation. I'm not going to say people who are opposed to hunting are bad. They've got one form of conservation. I would hope they would look at hunters too and say hunters bring a valuable things to the table when it comes to hunting.
We're conservationist hunters, and that means we understand that at times we give up hunting opportunity when a species is struggling.
Personally, I'm not really enthused about the idea of hunting wolves, but I'm not anti-hunting. I frankly can't imagine hunting a grizzly bear. But historically, hunting in North America has played a really important role in conservation, and I'm willing to accept the notion that if hunting is really well, carefully managed, it can be a good management tool.
Comparing hunters several years ago to today, are hunters in decline?
The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does a survey every 5 years, and in its most recent survey, we went from 13.7 million hunters down to 11.5 million hunters. At the end of the day, to put in perspective, only about 4% of Americans actually hunt.
So why is there that huge decline? Is it loss of habitat, less places to go hunt, or is there just not the interest?
Well, I think some of it is access, hunters being able to get out to lands where they can hunt. Some of it is just time. Really, the challenge is if we have fewer hunters, if we have fewer anglers going forward, who's going to help underwrite wildlife conservation in America? Because for such a long time, it's been hunters and anglers who have been funding wildlife conservation.
We're interested in finding some new sources of funding that aren't just hunters and anglers, that give more people an opportunity to fund conservation that maybe that don't hunt or fish.
To see a grizzly in the natural is an emotional experience. You recognize where I am at and the whole spectrum of life. And as a tribal person, you recognize the sacredness of this one particular four-legged.
The greatest danger to most wildlife is development. Wildlife corridors could be the answer to that problem. Y2Y or Yellowstone to Yukon, what are your goals?
The goal of Y2Y is to connect and protect habitat from Yellowstone all the way up to the Yukon. And really the goal is to preserve what is the last remaining intact ecosystem in the world, where you can find species like grizzly bear and wolverine and elk and caribou still living the way you did when European settlers first arrived on the North American continent.
When did you begin with this?
So Y2Y was formed in 1993. There was a group of kind of concerned citizens and scientists that realized conservation was really happening in an island scale. So you had these places like Yellowstone and Glacier and Banff National Park where you could find all of these species, but they were increasingly isolated. And as science really looked into how these species could continue to thrive, they realized that migration and movement between these islands was the only way for species not to basically become biologically extinct. And the great thing is over the past 25 years of Y2Y, the area between Jackson Hole and the Yukon has increased from 11% protected to over 21% protected.
And how long is this whole corridor?
The Y2Y region is about 2,000 miles from Jackson Hole all the way up to the Yukon, but the entire area that Y2Y is seeking to connect is over 500,000 square miles, roughly twice the size of Texas.
How will the corridor help the grizzly bear?
Y2Y and its partners work very closely with private landowners in between areas like Yellowstone and Glacier to try and purchase development rights or increase the use of conservation easements, which prevent additional structures and people and roads from impacting the landscape. Another thing that Y2Y has been very very supportive of is working with state and federal transportation authorities to build highway crossings in hotspots where there's been a lot of animal-human conflict and car accidents. We've seen success of those where, accidents have decreased over 80% in some of these migration hotspots. There's huge impacts for humans if we can reduce accidents and fatalities on highways and roads. And we also think that, has a clear impact for animal populations and their migration patterns.
And with climate change, how important are these corridors?
We increasingly see animals moving outside of their kind of original habitat zones due to changing temperatures and changing climates. And so a key goal of Y2Y is to essentially create this corridor where animals can move, for centuries to come when they're faced with the pressures of climate change. We don't want to see islands of conservation where we have grizzlies or caribou or wolverine that remain within Yellowstone, because that causes huge genetic challenges over time for biodiversity. And so yes, if we were to see a grizzly bear move from Grand Teton all the way up to Banff National Park or farther north, we would look at that as a huge conservation success.
On the edge of Yellowstone National Park, there's a place where you can go to get up close with grizzlies and wolves.
They both are apex predators, so they're top of the food chain. They are competitors in this ecosystem, but wolves are obligate carnivores. They only eat meat. They don't do anything else. And they're also very social. Bears are not. Bears are pretty solitary. Bears are opportunists, and they will subsist on seeds if they have to. They're, essentially 80% vegetable matter, 20% protein. But bears, they're a moving target in terms of the diet. The median life expectancy for a male grizzly was 21 in captivity. And while there certainly are older bears in the wild, most bears don't make it that long. The median life expectancy for a captive wolf is around 11 years, but in the wild, generally 3 to 5 years. One of the things that you always find is that all these animals are individuals. And so those two wolves, Summit is pretty much an expert fishing wolf, and he has been known to go completely into a pond when he's been in a deeper pool and actually dive in to go in after fish. Adara is just not as skilled or not as motivated. So I think a lot of the misconceptions people have about, say, bears and wolves comes from just a lack of seeing them and a lack of knowledge of what they're like. Some are really simple, like, oh, grizzly bears can't climb trees, and we demonstrate almost every day that they can. They climb right up them, no problem. A lot of people will say things like bears can't run downhill. Bears are interesting to watch because they look like they're kind of ungainly, but they can move like a freight train. They can run 35 miles an hour, so much faster than a person could ever run. People, I think, a lot of times come to this ecosystem thinking that bears are sort of bloodthirsty killers, and yet 80% of their diet is plant matter. People have this incredible fear of wolves, and while wolves certainly are dangerous if the right situations were to occur, most people would be really lucky to even see a wolf. They're so much more aware and wary than people are that they tend to just disappear. While you certainly should be safe hiking in bear country or wolf country, there are ways to do it safely, and there's not a bloodthirsty wolf around every corner waiting to jump your neck. Keeping animals, especially these apex predators, these large, dangerous animals in captivity is very challenging, and it's very challenging to do it right. So we do try and engage them with novelty such that they are alive with their sensory world. The containers are kind of a puzzle for them, and they learn how to break a lot of containers or get into a lot of containers and use their smarts and their power to do it.
Container testing is where our bears try to get into bear-resistant or not so bear-resistant containers, whether it be a trash can, a cooler, food storage locker, backpack canister. We're the only testing facility in North America that can give that IGBC certification as bear-resistant. We do use the term bear-resistant versus bear-proof. We feel that if you give a bear an unlimited amount of time, they would eventually get in a product. The bear's favorite food is going to be fish, peanut butter, honey, some meat. And the bears have gotten in enough products before that they know that there's a food reward in there. On average, the bears test anywhere from 60 to 100 products a year, and the pass rate is right around 65%. When we started testing, and our bear started testing 15 years ago, it was a 10% pass rate. So the manufacturers are starting to get it figured out.
It's actually very complex living with giant carnivores in your backyard. And so there aren't easy answers, and the only answers that seem to really work are when people work collaboratively together to find solutions. And some of the best success stories in certain areas are when ranchers and government agencies and private not-for-profits all work together and come up with solutions. And that's really where the best results seem to come from.